Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. I wanted to take a moment before we start to let you know about the Nurole board community, Nurole's new level of paid membership. I'm often asked by people how to get their first board role and build a portfolio career, and that's why we started the community, which catalyzes your board career by giving you access to smart online networking, one-to-one career guidance with our headhunters, peer discussion threads, third-party board roles, a find a mentor service, and Q&As with senior board members. We're running a limited offer of a 2-month free community trial for Enter the Boardroom listeners. Head to community.nurole.com and apply the code NBC2month. That's November Bravo Charlie, numeric 2, Mike Oscar November Tango Hotel. Today's guest, Baroness Helena Morrissey, is chair of Altum Group, Fidelis Insurance Group, and the Investment Industry Diversity Project. She is a governor at Eton College, where she chairs the Endowment Committee, and founder of the 30% Club, a campaign for more gender-balanced boards. Formerly, Baroness Morrissey was CEO of Newton Investment Management for 15 years, chair of AJ Bell and the Investment Association, and lead non-exec director at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. She has been named one of Fortune magazine's 50 greatest leaders, the Financial Times as Person of the Year, and among Financial News' 25 most influential people in the city over the last 25 years. Baroness Morrissey, a huge welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So I'd like to start with your experience where you've taken a stand as a non-executive. You were on the board of St. James's Place, and where you stepped down. And there have obviously been some challenging headlines for St. James's Place long after you left, where one recently was wealth managers face the music after years of rip-off fees. Did you see this coming?
It's a tricky subject, and I want to first of all say that I think obviously got a new CEO, you've got lots of new board directors, and I've got some great friends of mine actually work at the company now and are recent recruits and are doing what they can to kind of move forward from all of this. But when I joined the board at the start of 2020, I felt that the fees were not transparent and they were very complex. And I tried to raise this. I mean, it's in the public domain because I gave an interview to the Telegraph because they wanted to find out how it's going on at St. James's Place. And St. James's Place agreed to this interview, but having not got any joy and actually being told, and I understand, I mean, I want to come back to why people might say this because I'm not trying to land anybody in it again because obviously it's all come out in the wash now. I was told it was just off limits, the subject of the fees. And my argument really was, well, I don't understand them properly. Sort of, how can the clients understand them? And to be fair to me, I was appointed after the cufflinks and cruises scandal that they had the year before. And I went in as a change agent. And this was all very, I queried this. Were you ready for a bit of a shake-up? Because I had done a lot of work on championing the consumer, just generally, especially when I was at the Investment Association. So this should have been no surprise to anybody that I was going to take this stance. And I do understand, if you've got someone new in and they are rattling the cage and saying, and it's obviously was a big part of the business model, as is now very much acknowledged by St. James's Place. But my argument really was, well, the regulators will come up after this anyway, because it is not clear. Obviously, there's a lot of regulatory oversight on the transparency of fees, as there should be. But obviously, I mean, I learned from that, and I was new to non-exec work. So I perhaps didn't go about it the right way. I'm sure I made mistakes in doing that, but I learned how difficult it is to say something very unpopular because the business was going great at the time. I was like the miserable person in the corner saying, but what about the fees? And this was not what anybody wanted to hear. So I do think it's very difficult. I mean, I've done a huge amount of work on shaking out the boardroom through the 30% Club, and on the face of it, gone from less than 10% women on FTSE 350 boards to 42% now, and no legislation to get there. So that's, you say, great, but has the thinking changed? And my impetus behind the 30% Club was let's shake up cognitive diversity in the boardroom. Let's have new perspectives. I worked for Newton, where the motto was no one has a monopoly on great ideas. That was my rationale. And so I have to say, so now I worry that we've changed the look of the boardroom, but actually it's still very difficult to people to say something that might be unpopular. I mean, I look at the Barclays board back when Jeff Staley was first appointed, and there were stories about him in the Daily Mail about his links with Jeffrey Epstein. There was obviously all that stuff about the whistleblower that he was trying to find the identity of, and the fines from the FCA. A number of signals that things weren't quite right. And the board each time, which was very diverse, and I know some people on it, said we have full confidence in him, and so why? I don't know the answer to that, but what did people raise it and get slapped down like I was, or were people too nervous to raise it? And so I feel And it's an age-old problem. We have groupthink year after year, decade after decade, and we all afterwards say, oh, we should learn not to kind of do that. We should learn to listen to the challenger voice. But it is so hard to speak up if you are the lone voice on something like that. It is, and I'm not saying that to elicit any empathy or sympathy, because I made my bed and I laid in it at St. James' Place, and the fact that it wasn't something that we could discuss was a big signal to me. But I look back and I think I should have tried harder, and I'm glad that it's being sorted out now, but at great cost. And obviously they set aside, Mark Fitzpatrick set aside one of the 400 and something million pounds of a recompense, and you feel, oh, if we could do it all again, if we could go back to that conversation I had and someone answer it a bit differently or say, well, put a proper proposal in. I mean, I understand people can't just say knee-jerk, oh, I don't like it. That's not going to be very helpful. So yeah, lots for me to learn from that.
Gosh, so if for a non-executive or chair listening to this thinking, my gosh, if Helena Morrissey is sitting there challenging a board and finding it difficult to break through, what hope is there for those board members who don't have your kind of superstar standing?
Well, I would say one of the good things about a boardroom is that it's a pretty egalitarian place when you get in the boardroom. I mean, no one stands on any kind of status or, you're as good as your contribution in the boardroom. And I do think maybe if you're a very seasoned board director, perhaps you're given a little bit of extra thing. But I was a new person in the room. So in some ways, I was the beginner there. And I understand why. And it was raised during the interview process. I raised it. They gave me a little booklet to the fees, and I was clearly borrowing a bit. So there was a chance for everybody really to say. But I did think when I joined the board that I would be able to get that point sort of more on the agenda.
Is that true that there is no hierarchy in the boardroom? Because in my experience of boards, there is often, even though everyone is equal, there is often a decision maker or a very significant influencer, and often it's the chair.
Yeah.
But sometimes it can be someone else who's just a heavyweight thought leader, and people you can see, they'll end up watching to see what they go with before weighing in themselves.
No, that's probably true. It's probably wrong to say. I suppose I was meaning that any past achievements don't count for anything when you get in the room. It's then what you're going to contribute. And I do agree. I think that there's often a leader within the board or a couple. Sometimes it's a couple. And obviously one hopes, sometimes I've sort of explored why is someone being listened to so much? And then, they are independent, but they've been around a long time, or they know the CEO, or they get, sometimes there's the kind of, but it usually is because they are, as you say, thoughtful. People people have seen them be right in the past. But it does diminish the board if you've got that, because obviously people have been appointed in their own right. And in a way, what I worry about sometimes, I have seen, I suppose, the flip side of that, where people are a bit cowed in the boardroom. And perhaps I was guilty of that in this situation. And I remember when I chaired the Investment Association board, and I was the only woman on the board with 18 people, even though I was the chair. That was quite a challenge for me. And I would pick my spots. There would be like 3 items on the agenda that I knew I would have a differing opinion from the majority. And I'd think, okay, partly because I didn't want to be the annoying woman in the room, if I'm honest, because I'm the only one. I would think, okay, I really care about number 1. And number 2, I'm all right with, I can let that go. Number 3, I'm going to go in on. So I would pick 1 or 2 and really go for that, because I'd know that I would otherwise slightly lose my nerve. It's tough if you don't have, so this is maybe something, again, if I had my time again, and if we'd hadn't had the pandemic, so you were meeting in person, because this all became a bit magnified, because you haven't got the relationships, you haven't got the credibility, you haven't really built up, that credit in the bank. And then when you meet online, it became much more sort of, we've got to get through this agenda kind of thing, rather than let's go down the alleyway on this one, or let's sort of explore that idea a bit more. But I think my advice to any new board director is definitely to cultivate some relationships within the board, so that you have your allies. You don't have to always agree with each other, but someone who will bring you into the conversation sometimes, even if the chair isn't minded to, because there's different personalities in the boardroom. It's not all people who are very gung-ho, and it can be difficult to get particularly if you have a dissenting opinion.
One of the things we do on the community is a speed networking event, which is a lot more fun than it sounds, I promise. And we usually have them built around specific topics. And one of the topics we did recently was something called Cassandra syndrome, after the Trojan priestess who was predicted the fall of Troy, but was cursed never to be believed. And it was a theme that we picked up through the masterminds. It happens too often that people see these things coming, and yet they're not heard. So you've talked about one thing someone listening to this who might be facing that situation can do, which is build relationships with the board.
Yeah.
Anything else you've learned from your experience that someone in that situation can do?
Yeah, I think that I'm not a quitter. In most of my life, I've battled through things and I've got lots of children. That isn't always easy when you combine that with a career and so forth. But I think in this case, because I felt I had made a mistake by speaking to the press about something I was obviously frustrated about, wasn't getting anywhere. And I ended up having to be asked to apologize to the CEO for my remarks about the fees. And I kind of just went, at that point, I was at such a low ebb. I thought, I've just joined this board. I'm not getting my point that I really want to get across. I've now burned all the bridges with everybody on the, by speaking out on I was just asked a straight question by the journalist. I hadn't intended to kind of bring it up necessarily. I was just asked, you asked me the question, I gave an honest answer. And what I should have done with hindsight, and that's where I think going to your mentors, your allies, somebody outside that situation who can speak to it in confidence. Obviously, these are very sort of privileged conversations. So you might want to disguise the example a little bit, but just kind of get some ballast and get somebody to give you that extra boost that you need to kind of not lie down and play dead, which is what I did, really. And I think when you look back at the financial crisis, a lot of people were calling out the indebtedness of Western banks, the leverage in the system. As the famous quote said, the music kept playing, everyone kept dancing until it didn't. And again, you think, well, what stopped those people who saw it coming, not saying anything? And it was the vested interest, what's going to happen to me. It's a very tough gig in that situation, to stand up and sort of speak out of turn, really. As we said, no one likes a Cassandra. But the reality is what I have learned, and this is why if anyone is listening and has a situation that they can have a parallel to and they're afraid about speaking up, work out a way of doing that, because the problem will only get worse and it'll come back. You can't hide these things under the carpet, as we've seen in that particular example. And it costs more money, more people suffer, the problem gets worse. But it doesn't go away just because you haven't raised it. So if you join a board, you're doing it in good conscience because you want to work for the company and act in the best interest of all the stakeholders. And therefore, that's what you're signing up to. Somehow you got to persevere.
Interesting. Listening to you talk, it reminds me actually, a number of our mastermind participants have brought issues where they've had doubts about raising them and then found themselves re-energized by the group saying, no, you've got to raise this, and gone back and having, I think in particular, it's the considering what's the worst that could happen here has been helpful for them. And when often as a board member, you feel quite on your own and you don't have a sounding board. And so just being able to verbalize that, what's the worst that could happen, seems to have really helped. How have you thought as a board member? I think one of the most difficult decisions you face is when to disagree and commit and when to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm standing down.
Well, people have their different levels, I suppose, where they think, actually, we've had the cabinet meeting, as it were, and then you get behind the decision and move on. And I think for many topics, it's not a life or death or go or stay kind of issue. I think it is over something like, if the CEO has done something that you think is completely defensible. I think it's over perhaps a proposed acquisition that you think is a complete mistake. I think these are the kind of big topics. Obviously, the idea is that you sign up, and I've had a couple of missteps in my early non-exec directorship time, but now things seem to be going more settled, but you've got to fight on most of the time. And so, yes, have your say, make sure you've got your points on the table in most cases, and then move on. But if it's just something that you actually has changed the nature of the company for you to the point where you cannot in good conscience serve on the board, then that's the time to go.
You've talked a lot about learning. You've obviously got a very strong growth mindset. What, for someone who's about to embark on their non-exec career listening to this, do you know now that you wish you'd known at the start of it?
Starting out just as we hit lockdown, it made it harder to build the relationships. And I think that absolutely is critical. So now the boards that I've joined in the last few years, I spend a lot of time at the formal induction, but you've got to do more than that. You've got to understand everybody on the board, including the people that you're probably going to tend to disagree with. There's a good board would have people that you'd be violently in disagreement with as well as agreement with some of the time. And so really understanding that and spending time really beyond the headlines, beyond the surface, getting to know people is critical. And I think spending time with the chair is, again, absolutely vital, because clearly if you're going to make a contribution, the best course I ever took was one on inclusive chairing. And I thought I was inclusive chair before I took the course. And then I realized I was but a poor imitation of an inclusive chair, because this course was teaching you that actually what you're not trying to meet is to confirm everything you knew before you went in the room or when you went in the room. It's the new things. It's the new ideas. It's the new piece of information. And obviously inclusive chairing is definitely going to be bringing out those opinions that might not get heard. Everyone's heard from the person who's always going to contribute on every topic, and you probably know their position before you even go into the room. So a skillful chair will bring out that contribution. And when I chair boards, I don't ask for everyone. I explicitly ask them not to feel that you need to contribute on every single point, because obviously then you just go round and round. It's like having a panel discussion with everyone's asked the same questions, diminishing returns by the time you get to the 10th person. But to really, I'll work on what they want to discuss before the meeting and make sure that we haven't skipped over anything, that they've had an opportunity to say their piece, particularly if they've got an outlying view. So make sure you have a great relationship with the chair. And if you feel a bit shy, if it's your first ever board, then just double down on all of that and you won't be irritating. People will admire you for kind of wanting to step up and understand about the company. I've never seen anybody rejected for trying to schedule too many meetings with people. They like that.
What does that mean in practice? You've talked about the chair and the non-execs. Is it also the execs?
Yeah.
But in terms of in practice, is that about booking time for a coffee with them or a lunch with them or going for a walk with them? Or what do you do?
I keep it quite informal, but often, I've realized that, especially if you're meeting execs, they will tend to produce a presentation for you and talk you through. So what you're really trying to do is go beyond the headline narratives. And you really want to understand what makes them tick, what they love about their job, what they don't like, what they worry about. That's really valuable information as you go into a business, and that personal relationship, that personal rapport. And maybe I'll say, let's just have a coffee. Don't bring a deck. Let's just I think coffee's great because lunch can end up sort of taking forever. Everyone's sort of rushing to get back to their office or their desk. It just really shows again that you're interested, that you want to learn. You're not coming in with preconceived notions that you're going to sort of push down on everybody. So yes, I just go that extra mile, I think, when you're starting out. And then if you hit roadblocks, what I should have done in that situation is perhaps I should have gone and talked to the SID about it, or I should have said, I've got this concern. I, again, look back and I think I was very naive about the different sort of ways that you can get a point across if it's not immediately landing. Perhaps it would have been the same result. Who knows? Probably would have been. But you, again, can take it offline. You can go and try things one-on-one. Don't be just put off by something not quite landing the way you'd hoped it would the first time.
How much do you use in-camera board discussions to get these sorts of things out if it's the executive blocking, just discussions amongst the other non-execs?
So, all the boards that I've ever sat on have always had what we would call here in the UK non-exec session, what the Americans would call an executive session. And I don't understand that because you ask executives to leave the room. And I think that is, again, I think it's good practice. Even if you're running way over time, I think it's just to say, let's have a non-executive session, ask for the executive to leave the room. And I think at the end of every committee, particularly obviously audit, just make sure that it's seen as completely, use the training expression, safe space, so that people don't feel anything that's off limits. That was the worst thing about that experience for me, that I was taught off limits, because that is not something that you forget. You need to have people realizing, and if you're new to a board, you say, I've got an issue. You might feel that you're the only one, but as you said, what's the worst that can happen? People might disagree.
One of my favorite pieces of content recently was from Reid Hoffman, who wrote about the 8 rituals common to the highest performing boards that he's worked with across the thousands in the scale up space. Really interested. You've worked with a wide range of boards, to know what, as chair, are the rituals that you've brought in, having had the opportunity to cherry pick from the best that you've seen.
What would you mean by a ritual? Just to check I'm on the right ballpark here.
A ritual might be something like when they are discussing a set of opportunities, he will basically ask all of the board members, he'll give them 100 points. And he'll ask them independently to each allocate those 100 points across the different opportunities that they are considering, so that you don't suffer from the person who's speaking first anchoring everyone else, but you get the true value of the cognitive diversity in the room. And then you look at that picture, and I think they use an online tool to do it, and you can see where the points are different. And you can very quickly see, well, we're all really aligned here.
Yeah.
And actually there's huge divergence here. So let's spend our time discussing where we're different.
Yeah.
So that would be one ritual.
Yeah.
Another would be where he asks all board members, the exec and non-exec, before the meeting to write down the answers to a few questions, which are, how's the business going and what do you want to focus on in the meeting? Yeah. And so then again, you've got an aggregated list and you can see what everyone else has said once everyone has submitted, and you can vote up or down. So again, the agenda then is spent on the time that everyone collectively, not allowed a speaker, thinks it's where you need to be spending your time.
So happily, I have introduced that second one. And so before board meetings, I have scheduled calls with all of the non-exec and exec directors, ask them those 2 questions. I've actually had the call rather than got them to write it down, and I'll write it down on my end. And what I realized that way was when you're having a discussion with the company secretary or with the executives about what's topical, that list only vaguely overlapped with what the board members actually wanted to talk about, particularly the non-execs. And so what I've now introduced, and some of these boards that I'm working on are relatively new because, for example, just listed. So obviously everything is a little bit evolving quite quickly. And so now we're changing the cadence of the board preparation. I think one of the worst things is kind of a formulaic approach. This is the standing agenda items, shuffle in a couple of topics that we know are key, and then off we go. Whereas actually the likelihood is if you haven't met for a quarter or a couple of months, then there will be things that are on everybody's minds. And so that has been very striking to me that I'm already 3 out of 3 on the top 3 topics. So I also think being very rigorous about if you aren't getting enough time for certain topics, or if you aren't scheduling enough time, so you're constantly running over or constantly feeling everything's in a rush, and obviously that's not great if you want to do topics justice. There's obviously a balancing act between very tight. For the last Board of Effectiveness review, one of the board members said that I needed to run a tighter ship, and another one said I needed to give more time to all these kind of questions. So I was like, okay, so this is obviously I'm not going to be able to win on both of these. Somebody wants to race through the agenda, another person wants to take 3 days where we take 2. So being honest about actually, and what I've done there is I've changed. I've said, we got to meet. We're trying to do too much in a day. Let's meet the day before, half a day, dinner, new day, fresh energy, thinking overnight. Pretty obvious practical things, really. But I think that makes such a difference to everyone ending up with sort of bad tempered after 8 solid hours and just feeling like the biggest topic was left to the end or something and crop up right at the end. So that's the other thing, going into the meeting, because I would have those calls with people 3 to 4 weeks ahead of the board agenda being sort of finalized. And then, of course, all the board decks around the normal management information are in train, and then these topics will be worked through. But then going into it, something might have happened the week before. So again, you got to be a bit flexible. That's my other sort of hack, I suppose, as the chair. Don't just plow on regardless and leave the big topic to the end, but say at the beginning of the meeting, okay, we're going to change things around. This is what we're going to address. I mean, it's so obvious, really. You wouldn't go into any normal other meeting. You could have a family gathering. You wouldn't ignore the elephant in the room and carry on as if nothing had happened. You address it. So I think that kind of openness. And I've learned to have a lot of the topics that are really knotty. For example, that's compensation is always a challenging one for executives. But instead of just like, let's get in the room, thrash it all out, I've had subgroups meet in the run up, like weekly meetings, have a little project meeting so that even if we don't nail it in the meeting, we got so far down towards a proper solution. Because board time, again, that's one of the intrinsic challenges. I mean, even if you had 8 board meetings a year, I'm involved on several boards that are global. So the travel, that it's just not practical to extend sometimes. So you just got to work out a solution to this age-old problem that you might run out of time. And therefore the prep, say one word, prep. If you're a schoolboy listening to this, you're going to know, or schoolgirl. But yeah, it's absolutely vital that you go into that room, and whether it's because you've got a real clear sense that there are 6 topics that are really going to be the tricky ones, or 3 even, or you've just got a long way to go before you've agreed on the compensation arrangements or whatever it is, you're ready. And that makes a huge difference between whether it ends up feeling like a bit scrappy, run out of time, no one was really satisfied, to actually, that was a great meeting and you want that feedback. That's the last thing, feedback. No, just wait for the annual board effectiveness review. I ask people, and sometimes it's pretty obvious if it hasn't gone well, so don't sort of belabor the point if we didn't achieve what we wanted to do in that day or 2.
Do you do that? So I do at the end of every meeting. I ask, this is with my executive team, and actually I've got the boards that I'm involved with to do it the same. I ask everybody by show of hands to score it on a score of 1 to 10, and then go through what went well, even better if, and I leave like a good chunk of time to allow that. And because you do it every time, it becomes a lot less pointed.
Yeah.
And so actually when you have a bad meeting, I really like that in some ways because it's a great opportunity opportunity to learn. Yeah. When you do those people, what's your approach?
Oh, well, I think I'm going to adopt that, Ollie, actually. I think that sounds a very good show of hands at the end of the meeting, because I would tend to go back to people after. Especially one of the things I find is that everybody's after 8 hours, which can happen, of pretty much no breaks. It's not a great moment. Even if you got there in the end, no one's going to say, yay, that was great, because it was painful. But I think I usually go back to people a day or 2 later, and I'll put in calls with people if the things gone wrong. When we had a board effectiveness review and there were kind of a couple of weaker scores, but no further commentary about it. So I schedule meetings with people. But I think maybe a lot of non-execs aren't quite used to that slightly seat of the pants sort of feeling about it. But it's probably a good thing to get used to, because otherwise we go back and we start to convince ourselves that we got there in the end. And those big topics, it might also be a way of just checking that we haven't missed something big as well, because it might be a chance saying, was there something that you wanted to raise? You didn't get a chance to.
Another penny drop moment I've had recently, talking to a previous podcast guest, Roger Martin, who was talking about the strategy day and why strategy days or 2 days are so often, for, in his experience, 80 to 90% of organizations are failure. Because the way he described it was the executive team prepare like an A-star student for this big exam, and they come to that meeting and all they want is a gold star from the board telling them they're great. Meanwhile, the board come to that meeting thinking we've got to add some value, and so we've got to change the way they're thinking about it. So, and their goals are diametrically opposed, and everyone comes away feeling disgruntled because the exec feel like they didn't appreciate all the work that we did and they didn't understand it anyway, and the board come away thinking, well, they didn't listen to the challenge we gave them. And his solution to that is to break it down into stages, to say first you spend some time agreeing what the problem is, then you go away and you all come up with a set of options, solutions and assumptions around what would have to be true for those solutions to be the good ones. You agree that, and then you go away again and people do some more work to finalize those up and really get the detail behind it. And by breaking it up, it becomes a much more collaborative. What's your view on that? Because obviously that iteration takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
You know, as you said, people are pressurized in time in boards, got lots of other commitments.
That is exactly what we did. We didn't set out as beautifully as you just have, but we did it at AJ Bell when I was chair, because when I joined, I went to one strategy day that was before I was chair, and it was like a 2 days. And again, you get this sort of sense of, I think it probably wasn't quite as 80% disaster, but it was still like maybe it didn't feel quite that we'd achieved all the things that you would want to achieve. And certainly the last half day of a 2-day session anywhere is going to be a little bit like lackluster, and everyone's sort of had enough, especially got dinners and lunches and you see each other for those full days. So what we did was change it and had the executive come up again with sort of, I suppose, the range of options, some of the problems, some of the things going great. And then that started, instead of us just meeting in July, which I understand, that started in like March. And we went through and we'd had 2 board meetings in between. They had March and May, we had April and June. Then we met for 1 day and it was so much better. It was iterative, and some of the topics that we'd felt we never quite have enough time. This is always going to be the case. I'm not picking that company specifically, but it's always going to be the case that there's a big shall we go into kind of question, whether it's a region or a new type of investment or something that you want to give proper time to. But this way we got to discuss that before we actually got to the strategy day, and we don't want it on the agenda anymore because we looked through that and we gave it this proper time. So I think it's very important to have strategic discussions in the board. Otherwise you are just sort of second guessing the execs. But I think it's a good practice to do it in a kind of evolutionary way. And certainly I'm not a fan. I did have one online for 2 days when it was the pandemic, a 2-day strategy day online. I mean, I really lost the will to live by the end of that, because we literally, people turn off the camera, they're just standing up to shake their legs or go to the mill, get a cup of coffee. It was desperate. You felt so unhealthy and so eyes glazed over. I just don't think the human being is supposed to operate like that for 2 days in a little cell by yourself. So that was a nadir of it all, really. But I believe that strategy days can work, but let's be honest about it. And I certainly witnessed the A-star student presentations and everyone feeling a bit unhappy at the end of it. So let's be more open about what are the questions. Go before the present. A lot of it, people will be working on it, not realizing that there are these specific things on people's minds. So again, a bit more dialogue earlier on about what do we actually want to discuss here. We don't want to just have a rollout of how brilliant everything is going in the Northwest or this new product that we've launched. We know that because that's our normal board meeting, but we're actually not sure if we should embark on this venture or should we hire this new team, find a team in this particular area that we're probably going to struggle to build from scratch. Questions where you then can benefit from hopefully it's not just manufactured or we must add value, but actually people with experience of doing some of those things.
Yeah. You talked earlier about the inclusive chair being a course that you did, being an eye-opening moment. Can you talk more about the sort of practical insights that you took away from that?
Yeah, so often a lot of it was about rather just being much more aware of what you already know when you go into the meeting and making sure you don't just repeat that. And obviously that's not just for the chair's benefit, for everybody. So the typical thing is people have submitted the board packs and then they walk through the presentations. And actually we know all of what's in the presentations because we walked through. So obviously you want to give the exec or whoever's done the presentation a chance just to highlight anything that they might think doesn't come through from emphasis in the report. But you've got to move on with the questions quickly, and you've got to know going into it where are the likely issues with things. So that was a very interesting thing, because I think it's almost like maybe laziness. Sometimes people just think, oh, there's the agenda, there's the pack, there's the report. Someone's going to, even if it's headlines, they're going to walk through it. And that's really not adding anything really. And then this other point about knowing your characters. And of course, we all know the people who are going to talk a lot or pipe up whenever there's an opportunity. And then we know the people are going to be a bit quieter, but it's sometimes a little bit more subtle way. There's somebody who might not normally be the person to contribute on an issue, but might actually have the exact right point. So and obviously you're not a complete psychic. You don't know exactly what that was going to be, but it might be someone who's got a marketing background in a non-marketing company who's got an idea about a risk to the brand or something. There might be something that comes up in the risk committee that person's got. You've got to be really agile, is the way I'll come back to, and attuned, and then make sure that you haven't just kind of been ABC, we're done, but go around those alleyways, because that's where the interesting things come out.
Now, before we move on to the lightning round, I want to quickly talk to you about the board's role in supporting working parents. You've been a long-term advocate for greater parental support.
That's a long-term parent. It's also true.
Arguing for flexible working, for example, before it became fashionable. It's something I also feel very passionately about, that the current statutory support doesn't work, especially for single parents. At the same time, it's incredibly challenging for organisations, especially smaller organisations, to cover the cost of parental support. What's the board's role?
So I think the board should have a role, and perhaps I can just take one step back, because I think we talked about strategy days, and I'm one of these people that thinks that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And before you get into the strategy discussion, you need to make sure you've got the right culture, the right people. All the blow-ups that we've had have all been because the culture's wrong, or there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, as they say, that it might not be the whole culture, but a bad apple, someone's been able to get away with something. So culture first, and culture obviously comes from the people that you have as well as so-called values, but often values are written on a page, they're not lived and breathed. So if you're going to have the right people, you got to have, and I'm going to quote, it's going to sound very, liberal kind of thing. But anyway, so Aviva investors, when I questioned them about why they introduced equal paid parental leave in 2017, and I wasn't obviously questioning them, why the hell do you do this? I was praising them, but what was the motivation? They said, well, we wanted happy employees. And we knew that happy employees would be more likely to stay with us, be really engaged and productive when they're in the office, better retention, obviously. And so I thought, wow, that's real. I've never heard a company say, we're doing this because we want happy employees. And they said, we think happy employees are people more likely than to have a happy family life. And therefore we want men to play as much of a part in that as the women. And we have a lot of men here because it's a financial company. So then we started this experiment, really. I mean, they didn't describe it as an experiment, but I don't think they knew exactly what the take-up would be and how much it would cost, etc. And most boards, I don't think that having a focus on what they would call diversity, equity, inclusion, but is really just kind of the talent and making sure that different types of people are supported in their arrangements that mean that they will be able to be very productive, very engaged, work hard, and be happy in their lives and sustain their work as well, sustain their energy. I don't think boards ever discuss that. I actually do not record a single board discussion. And obviously some of the boards where I'm chair, it actually has come up, but that's because I've engineered it. But it's not something the boards look at. I mean, I've suggested that, for example, that diversity should be on strategy day discussion. And of course, now diversity has become a bit of a tarnished word. People are sort of associating it with woke capitalism. But obviously, go back to what the word actually means, having different brains, having no one has a monopoly on great ideas, attracting different types of people with different experiences and backgrounds. I mean, I think the diversity on the boardroom will be really shaken up when we have socioeconomic diversity, because people, men, women, black, white, who've all been very similarly educated, are probably going to think more alike than people who come from very different backgrounds. So I think boards should be making sure that they have the right policies to encourage people to work in all sorts of ways. And obviously I work, most of my roles in the city and the finance sector, where there's been quite a reversal of the working from home regime. A lot of companies are struggling to enforce it. I have had conversations very recently and they've said it's supposed to be 3 days. It's like 40% of people do that. It's just very hard to enforce it because there's still a war for the best talent. But I think the boardroom should get more involved in this. And I think it would change things, because at the moment I worry it's all becomes a bit tick boxy and people say, oh, we can't afford this, can't afford that. And they forget that actually might be a really good investment. If you've got a great, Aviva introduced this policy to say 2017. Now, men on average take an average of 5 months paternity leave, and it's paid. And that's just absolute revolutionary, really. And 12 other firms in the investment industry, which is where the diversity project focuses on, have done the same. No one has reported anything adverse from this. And it's given people, one of the unforeseen consequences is given people job or career development opportunities, because sometimes instead of getting cover, if someone's out for 4 months, they say, oh, could you help out on that desk? And there might be a desk that's going places. Their desk might be sort of struggling a bit in terms of work. And that person likes what they do and ends up staying there even when the person comes back. And so it's been a win, really. And yes, they did improve retention and didn't lose people when there was obviously a lot of resignations over the pandemic and after that. So I think boards, in the moment, we've got regulations likely to come from both the FCA and the PRA. Everyone's giving them a little shorthand of DEI regs, which is not going to make them land well, because everyone will go, it's going to be asking for rolling of eyes moment. But actually what we're talking about is great conduct, good conduct, not having sexual harassment. I think that should be a given, really, but it's sadly not. And making sure that if something goes wrong, the board is up to speed with it. And we saw with Alison Rose and Nat West and Coots last year, different kind of example, but sometimes things go badly wrong and the board or the chief executive doesn't know about it. I think we'd just make so much more progress if boards said, actually, we want to know, what is our policy there? Statutory paternity leave, as you say, is 2 weeks. And I think I saw a survey the other day saying 14%, 1/4 of men felt they felt mentally, physically and emotionally ready to go back to work after that. But it's just not compatible with the kind of culture that you presumably want to have, and the teamwork and enjoyment. And ultimately, I do get it with small companies. I think that is a big challenge, because in a person's career, taking a few months off when they have a child, unless they're going on to have as many as me, but it's neither here nor there if we're going to work 50 years. But if they're only staying a short time at a company and it's a small company, I really get that. And I think we need to do some work on that and how the government can help. The shared parental leave obviously didn't have a financial component, so it doesn't make any financial sense So I think we can do more, and I think it's important that we do more, and that perhaps there needs to be a government role in re-establishing the value of the family. A bit controversial topic, although it seems strange to say that it is, but very little has been done about that in recent years. And I think, and obviously you still get pregnancy discrimination, you still get all sorts of not so wonderful things happening when people are having what is still these days the majority of people have children. So it needs to be kind of, they say, normalized, really, and boards need to know. I think it's a great question to ask board directors, what our policy is.
There is a growing number of people who are deciding not to have children. One of the things I've sometimes wrestled with a finite resource base is, how does one allocate that resource fairly? And if you have members of your team who are taking parental leave, effectively you are paying them an increase on a sort of per hour, per day basis than you are to those who are not doing that. And I sort of wrestle with, gosh, how do I justify that for myself and to others in the team who either can't or choose not to have children?
It may not be great for cost control, but there are other ways that you could say people could have a volunteering allowance. They could have a allowance of days to do something that they want to do, like the passion project idea that Google did many years ago. I don't know if they still do that, where people had a day. It's probably gone a long time ago now. But I do think there are often, when I was at Newton as a CEO in 2001, we had a bit of a perfect storm and I was under pressure to make redundancies. And instead, I asked for volunteers for a 4-day week. I thought it was going to be all parents that would come forward, but it was not, actually. And quite a lot of people came forward who had a hobby. They wanted to have a different work-life balance. This was for a 6-month period. And then it was the option of the person taking it, whether they came back full time or not. And we would prorate their salary, but they'd still be entitled to holiday and pension as normal. So they weren't, it was a win from them from a financial point of view. But as many men as women came forward to do it, in absolute numbers, and several powerful men, including fund managers, stayed on that 4-day week, like indefinitely. So 15 years later, when I left Newton, there was a guy who was like running the most money and he worked a 4-day week. And it kind of meant, it took away from this being just a parent thing. It meant that when somebody said, oh, I want to work 4 days when they came back after having a baby, people would go, oh, it's a mummy track. It was compatible with promotion. It's compatible with doing great work for the company. It was compatible with your career development. and it wasn't seen as kind of like a dead end thing. So that's one way. It would mean that you'd be paying everybody more. That's the only trouble. Well, you say you might not like my idea on that one, but there's other things you can say to people. Look, I'm not expecting you just to pick up the slack. And what would you like to do? Is there something that you would particularly want to take a 6 weeks sabbatical or something? I mean, again, complicated for you, but a way around what might seem unfair.
Time has flown by,
Goodness,
which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
I am.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most.
Patronising behaviour.
Most valuable board ritual.
Is the prep before the meetings.
Favourite quote and why.
I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something, and I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. Edward Everett Hale, who is an American minister, historian, and author, and it's my motto or my mantra for when I feel overwhelmed, but I know I can make a difference.
Most significant professional insight.
There are a lot of problems for which there are no obvious solutions, but together I actually have seen us create answers where there is nothing. If you get the right formula, 30% couples like that. You've got the right formula, problem you could never solve, suddenly it's solved.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I suppose I thought if you assembled 10 or 12 brilliant people, you'd get a brilliant board. Definitely, it's a bit like a football team. It's definitely the teamwork that is the critical thing. And it's definitely having the mix of characters, mix of skills, mix of experiences. And yeah, I have learned that sometimes the hard way. It's not necessarily the people best on paper that are best in the boardroom.
What are you invested in and why?
So quite a bit of different things. Property, a bit of private equity, some stocks and shares. I'm a former fund manager, so I have a very diversified portfolio. I think it's very easy to get very negative about all growth prospects, but I think there's some brilliant companies out there. And finding a manager, I'm not a great passive investor. I think I prefer to pay for a bit of, for active management, and I agree with. So yes, but don't put all your eggs in one basket. There you go.
Finally, 3 things that our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
So I'll go back to my quote, you're only one, but you are one, and say the regrets I have on my board career have been when I haven't pushed a topic where I was in the minority of one, but had a valuable point. Secondly, I do think we've got some work to go on true diversity of thought, and please don't be complacent about the fact that you might have a boardroom that feels very different from maybe 10 years ago. Have you actually got the thinking coming out? Are you going behind the scenes and eliciting the views? So I'd love people to take that away. And thirdly, I think it's really important that boards get into the people side of their businesses. And there's such a cliche. We talk about the assets going up and down the lift or working at home these days. Please don't just delegate that to management. Please try to understand the culture, try to understand the potential for poor behaviors, try to understand whether people that you think you might meet brilliant women who come and present and they're feeling miserable and undervalued and struggling with motherhood or whatever the problem might be. It might be a male carer or if it's dad. So there's all sorts of stuff going on in people's lives. The boards often feel like, oh, you're far too removed, but it's the real lifeblood of the company.
Helena, thank you so much for sharing your amazing experience and wisdom and the incredible honesty that you've done that with. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Ollie. Thank you for having me on.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the Nurole board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing, as well as Q&As with senior board members, smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, and a find a mentor service. We're running a limited offer of a 2-month free community trial for Enter the Boardroom listeners. Head to community.nurole.com and apply the code MBC2month.